I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and my favourite Star Wars is the Clone Wars. And this is the Republic Gunship from the Clone Wars. This is a 3D print designed by Darkfire Designs. It's Star Wars Legion scale, so it's 1:48, and I have plans to put it in a diorama. But first, here's how I made it. I'm lucky enough to own a printer, a 3D resin printer, that will put an entire spaceship in one go. But that does lead me astray. Sometimes I get print fails like these and these. I spy a video on how to make crashed gunships in the future from my print fails. But failures aren't the only problem. I ended up resupporting this with heavier support, got around the failure, but nothing could make it fit in my wash and cure station. And big supports leave big marks. But eventually I got all of my pieces washed, cleaned, cured, and support free. And then I could start assembling it. Because I have such a large printer, I was able to do this in 3 or 4 pieces, plus all the detail parts, and there's holes in there for wiring. Because I don't want to wire until the end, because I'm, going to be poking loads of stuff around, I decided I'd leave it all unassembled for now, paint it, and then put it together at the end. But before I paint it, there's some marks from holes from when I took the supports off. Where they snapped off, rather than me clipping them, they left a hole. And I'm using Tamiya basic putty. It's smelly, like a solvent, dries quite quickly and sands really nicely. And I used a lot of it along all the edges where there were supports. And the supports are on the bit that was nearest the build plate, so they're in a certain direction, and I'd made sure I put them underneath so they'll be less visible on the final model, but the perfectionist in me still made me fill and sand them all. And notice I'm wet sanding all the time with this to keep the dust down and to keep it out my lungs. I primed everything with Mr. Surfacer White. Nothing brings out the flaws like a fresh coat of primer. It helps you see everything, which sometimes you just can't with plain 3D print. And the primer showed up 2 different types of flaws. One, print artifacts like this. This is just the layer lines. You really can't get around it. And I just sanded them with some 400 grit. These are sanding sponges. They go around curves really nicely. I also had dimples left over from the supports. They dimple around where the first few layers of resin goes. It's not entirely smooth. So another layer of putty and filling and then sanding sorted that. Finally, I was ready to paint properly, and I started with another coat of primer. I need to even out the dark grey of the print and the white that had already gone on with the primer, and this will help just take out any remaining small scratches. I always use lacquer to priming because they really stick well, and this is Mr. Surfacer 1500 in white. One advantage of using an airbrush is you can do a technique called pre-shading. This is where you spray a darker colour around the panel lines and just splotchily across to add a bit of dimpling and weathering to your final surface before you spray that final paint. Now for this I just used black primer, nothing special. This is again Mr. Surfacer black primer, and I went round the panel lines. In the anime Clone Wars ships, they are very, very splotchy. They're not smooth and clean at all. These are gunships. They're always flying through battle. They're not polished and white. They are mottled greys. And this is the perfect technique to do that. And then I sprayed my white top coat. It's quite thin. I always thin my lacquers at 1.5 Mr. Colour levelling thinner to the lacquer paint. And this is super white. It's a beautiful gloss because I want to do enamel washes next, and it goes on beautifully and thinly so you can still see all that black, very importantly, showing through. Time to get out those reference photos, and it's an excuse to rewatch some episodes of the Clone Wars. I'm going to spray 3 more colours. A clarity red, it's kind of a bluish red, a olivey bright green, and a black grey. And for those, I'm also going to use lacquers and the airbrush to get a nice smooth finish. But what I need to do is make sure my white stays white. And the secret to that is Tamiya masking tape. The white one is for curved surfaces and the yellow one is for straights. Then I used cheap blue masking tape rubbed on my jeans so it wasn't too sticky to cover up any edges that were just going to stay white but didn't need to be nice and neat. And kitchen roll can cover some really big areas too. Now, the only problem was this is really cheap blue masking tape, and it actually started to come off, and I have a bit of overspray where it actually lifted. So be careful when you're doing this, because I didn't get any bad edges, I just got a little bit of overspray under the blue masking tape. The diorama this is going in is the Siege of Mandalore, so I base my colour markings off that. So it's russet, it's just a gloss for the wings, and then I had to mix a custom green out of primary yellow and primary green. Then comes the nerve-wracking and fun bit of taking off your masking tape and seeing if it leaked at all. I had a couple of spots, but that's what weathering's for. Hide them later. I'd had enough with masking, so I got out Black Grey by Vallejo acrylic paint to do all the black areas. There's not many, it was just quicker this way. Especially as one or two of them looked like they'd be quite hard to mask just because of where they went. The good thing about painting over a gloss lacquer is it is easy to clean off any mistakes. And now for my favourite part, panel lining. It's like magic. You touch one end of a line and it just flows along. This is basically an enamel wash. It comes in a handy little bottle, it's Tamiya, and it comes with a little brush. So it's perfect for just adding these lines very, very quickly. And I tend to use dark grey, not black, because I just prefer the colour. All you have to do is basically fill every line with enamel wash, wait a few hours, and then wipe it off with a cotton bud soaked in, I use odourless white spirits. Next I needed to add some decals, but my attempt at printing them, well, it was an abject failure. Instead I ordered one set, they were too small, and I had to order a second set before I got the right size. I should have trimmed these a little bit closer. I didn't realise how far the film around them actually went, but it's very simple to add decals onto a gloss surface like this. I did print a number of parts in clear resin, and this previous diorama that I'd done had a clear resin canopy, and I'd literally just sprayed it with gloss varnish. This time I wanted to see if sanding would get a better finish. The higher the number, the finer the sandpaper. So I started with 1,000 and went up from there. I went up to 2,500. Hopefully the gloss varnish will make this crystal clear. Next up was weathering. Now, these parts were all gloss painted so that the decals and panel lines will run. So I've actually put a coat of matte varnish. Two reasons for that. One, to seal in the decals so they won't get disturbed by the oil washes, and two, to make sure that the oil washes have something to grip to, otherwise they'll just slide off the shiny gloss. So this has had a coat of Mr. Colour matte varnish, and now I'm using Starship Filth, I love the name, as an oil wash. It's an oil colour by Abtalon 402, and you literally thin it with odourless thinners and use it to create just a pattern on the surface. Now we've already got the pre-shading. I wanted to put on some brush strokes almost, because it seems like they're there in the anime. And if you look, this brush is a weathering brush, so it's serrated tipped, which means it gives nice brush strokes that look quite random. The captions on the reference pictures say these are superficial burns from the exhaust of launching missiles. I also use some white oil paint to add chips round the front of the LAAT. Finally, I subtly darkened one or two panels before adding the odd streak. And now my headache began. I wanted to put LEDs in. I can't find my LEDs. I'm in the middle of building works and they're in a box somewhere. They're not in the box I thought they would be in. But I could find my tea lights, so I used the inside of some tea lights to get switches and batteries. But they were too big, so I ended up making battery boxes out of pieces of styrene and copper tape. I ordered some LEDs, they didn't work very well. I ordered a second set of LEDs and found if I wired the red and the blue together, the blue wouldn't light. So obviously there's a slightly different draw on them, and the current, voltage, whatever, someone will write it in the comments I'm sure, goes through the red in preference to the blue. So I ended up with 3 sets of batteries, one in the cockpit with one of these switches and 2 in the back. And then to add insult to injury, I decided to put these switches in. I couldn't get them on and off when they were finally in place. So I replaced them with reed switches, which I already had, and they just kept jamming on and off. They wouldn't stay reliably on. I couldn't get them to stay on, and I had to hold a magnet near them, which isn't very helpful for taking videos. So in the end, I bought some more reed switches. This is taking weeks at this point to get all these things to come one at a time, work out they don't work, and then do another one. And I swapped those reed switches for the new ones, and they're normally closed, which means they're on by default. And if you put a magnet that happily came with them next to them, then they stop. And they actually work. It's a pain to get the magnets on and off. They're sort of hidden underneath inside, but they work. And that's all I needed. These are the wing guns, and you can see that the clear isn't crystal clear, but it's 80% there. I think I need to do a bit more work on it. Perhaps next time I'll use Tamiya polishing compound. It's not a paint, it's a polish. But most of the pieces click in place without needing much glue. There's the odd dab of super glue in places, especially on the wings. The weight of them just pulls down a little bit. It definitely got fiddly trying to get those magnets and reed switches and everything sorted once the doors and everything were on, but thankfully they just clip on and off. I 3D printed a base that's going to match the diorama for it to stand on. There's a hole for a flight stand underneath. And I put some black pigment on just to add some battle damage. I haven't sealed it. If you're worried about it, another coat of matte varnish would do that. But I've got those gloss areas, so I wasn't keen on it. And with that, I was done. And here it is in all its glory. And cartoon style Republic Gunship, and I have to say it came out really well. Even those pesky LEDs, they do look better with the main lights off. This gunship is going to feature in a future diorama called After the Battle, after the Siege of Mandalore, and I'm busy painting people and designing a road scene for it. If you enjoyed it, remember, subscribe, hit the bell button, and if you want to support me more, consider joining Patreon or as a channel member. Otherwise, see you next time.